मशीन की तरह चाहता है।
एक्सेस दिया हुआ है इसका, सर लाइव है। बढ़िया, 2 मिनट लिए।
ओके, मेरे को आप वो डिवाइस दे दीजिए,
यूट्यूब से एप्लीकेशन पे
कहीं से भी दे दीजिए। हेलो एवरीवन, so please check whether audio and video is clear. We are going to start Union Economic Survey today. Thank you. Okay, so first thing first, Union Economic Survey is presented just to see the progress in the last financial year. So basically two documents are important, one is budget and one is survey. Budget talks about the projections and survey talks about the past. So in a very simple sense, budget specify what government is going to do in the upcoming financial year. Survey talks about what government did in the last financial year. Economic survey is prepared by the Department of Economic Affairs, that is DEA, under the guidance of Chief Economic Advisor. So two important things, A, DEA, that is Department of Economic Affairs, and second is Chief Economic Advisor. Now understand, Finance Ministry have 6 major departments. One is Department of Expenditure, one is Department of Revenue, one is Department of Economic Affairs, one is Department of Public Asset Management, one is Department of Financial Services, and last one is Department of Public Enterprises. So these are 6 departments. A very simple question can be asked. Okay. Now if we talk about the growth projections, so at constant price basically means at base price. What is base year? Base year is 2011-12. So at constant price, the growth rate in 2023-24 was 8.2%. Last year it was 7%. Last to last year it was 9.7%. So there is no specific trend. The trend is fluctuating. If you see, it is like this way. So very simple question can be asked whether it is going upwards or downwards. Please remember, there is a fluctuation. That means there is no specific trend. That is first thing. Second thing, if we talk about fiscal deficit is basically the borrowing of government. So during COVID, government had to borrow a significant amount, and that is why the fiscal deficit was quite high. Now government is trying to control that. So if you see the trajectory of fiscal deficit, so it was 9.2%, then 6.7, 6.4, and this is 5.6. So there is a clear downward path. That simply means government is trying to control its borrowing. Government had to borrow during COVID because of economic stimulus. That means government borrowed that amount to stimulate the economy. That is something which you have to remember. So far we have seen two trends, the growth trend. So there is no specific trend in the growth. Growth is fluctuating. In terms of fiscal deficit, yes, it is coming down. That is second thing. Now, if we talk about Forex, Forex is basically foreign exchange. So RBI is Forex manager. There are 4 major parts of Forex. One is foreign currency asset, second is gold, third is SDR, and fourth is RTP. SDR basically refers to special drawing rights. That simply means the right to draw. SDR is a unit of account of IMF. What is IMF? International Monetary Fund. So IMF is actually a Bretton Woods institution. Bretton Woods institution. And SDR provide the right to withdraw based on the quota contribution. Okay. Now the Forex, again there is a fluctuation in the Forex also, but in 2024 the Forex was $654 billion. So our Forex is quite high. Next, coming to, just a second, yes, coming to the sector wise growth. If you remember, yesterday we had discussed a question related to the growth of primary, secondary and tertiary sector in Bihar. So primary sector growth rate was, in comparison to previous year, was 6.7%, secondary was 6.8%, tertiary was 13%. If we compare it to the national one, so the growth in primary sector was 1.4%. Again, please remember one thing, there is no specific trend. Previously it was 3%, 3.3, 3, 3.5. So that means there is a zigzag pattern. In case of secondary sector or industrial growth, again there is a zigzag pattern. So last year it was 9.5%, previously it was 4.1%. In case of services sector, again the pattern is not fixed, it was 7.6%. So three growth parameters are there, 1.4%, 9.5% and 7.6%. Two simple question can be asked. A, which sector witnessed highest growth as per Union Economic Survey? So it was the secondary sector. Okay. Second important thing is that they can ask you arrange the sectors according to their growth. So secondary sector, then tertiary sector and then primary sector. Secondary, tertiary and primary. This was the growth in case of India. Now if we compare it with the growth of Bihar, sector wise growth. So basically in case of Bihar, the highest growth rate was in case of tertiary sector, then in secondary and then in primary sector. If we talk about the contribution, so roughly primary, secondary and tertiary. This is So in case of Bihar, the contribution was 20%, 20%, 60%. In case of India, the contribution is roughly 17%, roughly 29% and roughly 54%. Again, I am not quoting exact number, I am just giving you rough estimation. So very simple statement can be asked that the contribution of this sector in Bihar is this one and this sector in India is this one. You should be well aware of that one. Okay, now if we talk about three important ratios, one is primary deficit. What is primary deficit? Fiscal deficit minus interest payment. Revenue deficit. What is revenue deficit? Revenue expenditure minus revenue receipt. And third one is a fiscal deficit, that is total borrowing excluding basically debt creating receipt. In a very simple sense, fiscal deficit is total expenditure minus total revenue excluding borrowings. Okay, so if you see, the trend is like this. There is a downward trend in case of primary deficit, there is a downward trend in case of revenue deficit, there is a downward trend in case of fiscal deficit. So fiscal deficit was 5.6%, revenue deficit was 2.6% and primary deficit was 2%, and all these are coming downwards, 2%, 2.6% and 5.6%. That is something which you need to remember. Okay. Now if we try to cover the chapters, again it is not possible to remember everything, therefore I have covered the most important part from each chapter. So if we talk about first chapter talks about the state of economy. So the global growth rate was 3.2%, India's growth rate was 8.2%. That means India's growth rate was way higher than global growth rate. The contribution of each sector was 17% of agriculture, roughly 27.6% of secondary sector and roughly 54.7% of service sector. In terms of capital expenditure, the capital expenditure was 9.5 lakh crore, which is 2.8 times higher than the capital expenditure in fiscal year of 20. That means our capital expenditure is increasing. Capital expenditure basically asset creating expenditure. Now understand, government has announced various initiatives, for example PM Gati Shakti. So of course government is trying to increase the capex, that is capital expenditure. The fiscal deficit is 5.6%, we have seen it. How much was the revenue deficit? It was 2.6%. How much was the primary deficit? It was 2%. Now if our tax to GDP ratio is seen, tax to GDP ratio have roughly 55% revenue from direct taxes. 55% revenue from direct taxes, this is from direct, and roughly 45% is from indirect taxes. So very simple question can be asked, the contribution of direct taxes in the gross tax revenue was higher than indirect taxes. Yes, contribution of direct tax was roughly 55%, of indirect was roughly 45%. Okay, the budgeted expenditure on interest payment was roughly 30.4% of the revenue expenditure. That simply means the expenditure on the interest, let us say our revenue expenditure is 100 rupee. So revenue expenditure have a significant weightage of this interest payment. Actually there are three terms which we have discussed in previous class as well. IPS. What is this IPS? Interest, pension and salary. These are basically referred as committed expenditure. Committed expenditure. Why committed? Because government is bound to pay it even if it is not willing to. So yes, that is why it is referred as committed expenditure, and it is revenue expenditure, mind you. Okay, so interest payment constitute roughly 30% of the revenue expenditure. And last point is sovereign credit. Sovereign basically means government rating. So recently S&P global rating has been upgraded for India. That's a good thing for India, and previously our rating was stable, now it has been upgraded to positive. So these are the important things, 2-3 things. Our growth rate is higher than global average. Second thing, our deficit are coming down, fiscal deficit is coming down, revenue deficit is coming down, and primary deficit is also coming down. The problem is the low growth rate of agriculture sector. Why it is problem? Because vast majority is still dependent on agriculture, and the growth rate in agriculture is quite low. We have seen that it is less than 2%. For example, it was 1.4%. That is why it is a major issue. And that is why if you have seen in the last recent quarter, the growth rate of second quarter was 5.4%, and it is much lower than our projected number. That means somehow we will have to increase our domestic demand. Okay. Our capital expenditure has increased, government is spending money on infrastructure. That was the highlight of this particular chapter. Now coming to second chapter, that is about monetary authority. Now understand, after COVID there was a problem, and the problem was of inflation, and that is why the money supply was cut down by increasing the interest rate. Since then our interest rate is quite high. It is roughly 6.5%. Objective is to maintain inflation in a specific range. What is that range? It is a 4 plus minus 2%, and that is why RBI tried to maintain it. So our repo rate is around 6.5%, and therefore there is a problem. Problem is that now credit is not available at a low interest rate. Second thing, our agricultural credit increased nearly 1.5 times from fiscal year 21 to 2024, and it has increased to 20.7 lakh crore. Try to understand one more thing, our capital expenditure was roughly 9.5 lakh crore. Try to establish the relationship between numbers, and therefore it will be very easy for you to remember these numbers. Okay. Our NPA, what is NPA? It is non-performing asset. See, the loan given by bank is an asset for bank. Why it is asset? Because bank will earn interest on it. But if bank is not able to recover that loan, that is NPA, non-performing asset. So the trend is NPA are coming down. So NPA declined to 12-year low of 2.8%. Examiner can set a very simple trap that in last few years our NPA has increased significantly. No, they are coming down. Next is the financial inclusion is also increasing. Financial inclusion basically means people have more access to financial institutions. For example, the number of adults with account in formal financial institution has increased from 35% in 2011 to 77% in 2021. And two major players in this particular thing are, one is Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, that was basically announced to allow people to open bank accounts. Second one was digitization. So because of digitization, what is happening is that now people are able to access the banking facilities. इसी थोड़ा सा चला दीजिए. Okay, third chapter is about price and inflation. So the relationship is like this. If RBI will increase money supply, people will spend money, demand will increase, inflation will increase. On the other hand, if RBI will reduce money supply, inflation will be controlled. Okay, so the retail inflation basically means CPI, that is consumer price inflation. Retail inflation was 5.4% in fiscal year 2024 and it was majorly driven by declining fuel and core inflation. Two important things. Headline inflation basically means which cover volatile and non-volatile components. Core inflation basically covers only non-volatile components. It does not cover volatile components. What are those volatile components? Volatile component basically means the price fluctuate a lot in case of these components. Why it does fluctuate? The reason is food and fuel. In case of fuel, we are heavily dependent on imports. So if anything goes wrong in the global community, the oil prices increase significantly. That's first thing. Second, because we don't have storage infrastructure, we don't have well connected transportation facility. In fact, if you see in the last quarter, our inflation was more than 6%. The main reason was food inflation. In fact, food inflation was more than 10%. And within food inflation, majorly it was vegetable inflation, that is inflation price of vegetables. Okay, that was second thing. India's inflation rate was lower than global average. Two important things. Our growth rate was higher than global average. Our inflation is lower than global average. Now one homework for you. Try to compare, as per economic survey, try to compare the inflation rate in case of India versus inflation rate in case of the state, that is Bihar. Okay, the consumer food price index increased from 3.8% to 7.5%. Yes, that is why there is a problem. Okay. Apart from that, RBI joined this Project Nexus. Yes, this can be asked as a question. Project Nexus is actually a project between various Asian countries to allow digital cross-border payments. Cross-border basically means inter-country payment. So it is a multilateral initiative to promote cross-border online payments. And this is a grouping of 4 Asian countries: Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and India has joined it. So very simple question can be asked. Project Nexus is related to A option digital payment, B climate change, C space exploration or something like that, or D supercomputers. Next chapter is related to external sector, that means trade. So if we talk about our entire trade, so trade can have two major components. Basically, trade in goods and trade in services. Now in this case we have surplus, in this case we have deficit. Deficit basically means we import more than export. Surplus basically means we export more than import. Now these two are part of our current account. and this is also referred as balance of trade. This is a part of this current account and capital account. Second part is capital account. These are part of balance of payment. Balance of payment basically means the transaction of India with the rest of the world. That is balance of payment. Okay. So, our exports increased marginally, that is 0.23%, and imports declined 4.9%. Because of that, the trade deficit has narrowed down. What is trade deficit? Trade deficit is gap between export and import. In case of India, there is a current account deficit. Current account deficit means our imports are higher than our exports. Imports of goods. In case of services, we have surplus. So, overall there is a current account deficit. However, our exports has increased marginally. On the other hand, our imports declined roughly by 5%, and therefore, the current account deficit is reducing. The combination of current account deficit and fiscal deficit is known as twin deficit. What was fiscal deficit? It was the total borrowing by the government. Okay. Next is our merchandise trade. Basically, it refers to goods trade. This deficit narrowed, and it narrowed to $238 billion. India's service export increased by 14% annually over past 30 years, that means from 1993 to 2022, and our goods export growth was 10.7%. The global service export growth rate was 6.8%. So, very simple trends can be asked. A, our service export growth rate was higher than our goods export growth rate. Yes, it is correct. Global service growth rate, global service export growth rate was lower than India's service export growth rate. Yes, even it is correct. Apart from that, India has signed 4 FTA. FTA is free trade agreement. Yes, this can be asked as a question. So, these are Mauritius, UAE, Australia, and EFTA. EFTA is basically our trade agreement with 4 non-European Union member countries. That means with 4 countries who are not part of European Union. Now, the current account deficit of India has gone down, and it is 0.7% of GDP in 2024. Last year it was 2%. That means it has gone down. So, 2 important parameter, our fiscal deficit is 5.6%, current account deficit is 0.7%. Fiscal deficit is also coming down, current account deficit is also coming down, revenue deficit is also coming down, primary deficit is also coming down. Okay. Our growth rate was higher than global growth rate, our inflation is lower than global inflation. These are some of the transactions which you should remember. BOT is balance of trade, basically this trade account. Okay, now one more thing, these goods and services, they are sometimes referred as goods, basically means a trade in visibles. Visible as in goods are tangible items, so they are visible. For example, if we will export this pen, that is visible item. On the other hand, if we will export service, that is not visible, and therefore they are also referred as invisibles. So, in a very simple sense, examiner can ask you that in case of trade in visibles, we have surplus. Visible means goods. In goods, we do not have surplus, we have deficit. In case of services, that is in invisibles, we have surplus. Okay. Next is our external debt to GDP ratio, that means how much we have borrowed from outside, that has declined to 18.7%, and the share of short term debt in the total external debt decreased to 18.5%. 2 important things. A, how much amount we have borrowed from outside India, that is basically external debt to GDP. It is 18.7%. Try to remember, it is roughly 20%, 18.7%, 1/5. Within this external debt, 2 important trends are there. One, our short term debt is lower than our long term debt. Second thing, most of our borrowings are non-sovereign. Sovereign borrowing basically means borrowing by the government. Non-sovereign borrowing basically means borrowing by the private players. One simple way to borrow money from outside is ECB, that is external commercial borrowing. External means outside India, commercial means for business, B means borrowing. So, amount which is borrowed from outside India for business purpose. Why someone would borrow from outside India? Reason is interest rate, low interest rate. Okay. So, with this external chapter is over. Next chapter is medium term outlook. So, basically India is having a vision of being a developed economy. We have discussed this earlier also, that there is a document vision for Viksit Bharat. As per that is going to be a $30 trillion economy. Right now the size of our economy is, so roughly, again roughly 10 times the current size. But second thing, our per capita income is $2392. $2392. The goal is that by 2047 we will have $18,000 per capita income. $18,000 per capita income plus $30 trillion economy. As of now, the size of our economy is $3.3 trillion. One more thing, in terms of size of GDP, India is the 5th largest economy as of now. Recently, India surpassed UK, and UK is now 6th largest economy. The top 5 are, actually top 4 are US, China. Now, in some places you will see Japan, and in some places you will see Germany. The reason is because of recent recession, Japan is now on 4th, Germany is on 3rd, and then India, and then UK. In terms of triple P, that is purchasing power parity, India is on 3rd position. 3rd position basically means India is on 3rd position, China is on top position in terms of purchasing power parity, and US is on 2nd position. Okay, that's first thing. So, we want to be a developed economy by 2047, and the target is a medium term growth rate of over 7%. Second thing is, there is a gap between skill set. We are a young country, our working age population is quite high, but one thing is missing, and that is skill. In fact, the economic survey highlights that there is a skill gap challenge. Roughly 51.25% of youth are not employable. That means they do not have required skill set. Even if they are in working age, they will not get the employment opportunity until unless we provide them skill, and that is a major problem for us, because to utilize this working age population, we need to provide them the required skill set. So, now we are having two major problems. A, we do not have jobs. B, we do not have the skilled population, and that is why there is a major issue. Okay. Please check now. Okay. Now, for this upcoming duration, Amrit Kal basically means this upcoming time till 2047. So, we have 6 factors strategy. One is focus on the private sector investment. Second is focus on the Mittelstand. This Mittelstand basically means the small scale industries, that is MSME. In European countries, usually this term is used, and therefore it can be asked as a term related question, that this term Mittelstand refers to which of the following. So, it basically refers to MSME, that is micro, small and medium enterprises or small companies. So, first focus is private sector investment, second focus is small scale industries, third focus is agriculture sector, fourth focus is green transition. Green transition basically means towards the clean energy. Understand, the target is to be net zero by 2070. Net zero basically means net zero emitter of carbon. That means whatever we are going to emit, we will capture it back. Therefore, the net result will be 0. And that is why we are going to transit from current energy sources to renewable energy sources or towards the clean energy sources. This is basically referred as green transition. One more thing, during COP28, this COP28 held in Dubai, India had an agreement with Sweden, and Sweden is going to help India to start producing green steel. Green steel basically means the steel which will emit less carbon. So, wherever this term green is mentioned, it simply means we are trying to control our carbon emission. Then next pillar is bridging the gap between education and employment. We have discussed it earlier also that roughly half of our youth is not employable. Then building the state capacity and capability. State basically means nation state. So, simply we just want to upgrade our administration. For that, government has also announced Mission Karam Yogi to upgrade the capabilities of our bureaucrats. Okay. Now, let us move on to next chapter, that is climate change and energy transition. Now, in the context of climate change, recently one important thing was there. Okay, let me simplify three important conference. One is Rio Summit was held, Rio Summit. This was held in 1992 and it gave birth to three important conference or convention. United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that is first thing. Then UNCBD, that is Convention on Biological Diversity. Then UNCCD, that is Convention to Combat Desertification. So, this is for desert, this is for biodiversity, and this one is for climate change. Climate change. Okay, this is going on, this is COP16 actually, and this is going on in Riyadh. Riyadh is in Saudi Arabia. This is important because it has completed 30 years as it was signed in 1994. So, that is why it is important. The CBD held in Cali in Colombia, and this was COP16, that is Conference of Parties. This UNFCCC held in Baku recently, Baku in Azerbaijan, and this was COP 2019. Okay, this was related to environment. Now, we have a target that by 2030 we will have a capacity of 500 gigawatt clean energy, and that is why we are working in that direction. Please understand, right now majority of our electricity is produced through coal. Roughly 50% is produced through coal, roughly 20% is produced through solar, roughly 10% is produced through hydro, and roughly 10% is produced through wind, roughly 2% is produced through nuclear sources. Okay. So, India's energy transition strategies include achieving 50% non-fossil fuel capacity by 2030. The goal is 500 gigawatt of renewable or basically clean energy. In this context, there is one term which can be asked, NDC, that is nationally determined contribution. In a very simple sense, countries will specify how much they are going to contribute to control the climate change. So, what steps they are going to take to control the impact of climate change, that is basically referred as NDC, and sometimes it is also represented as INDC, that is intended nationally determined contribution. So, our target is that we will reduce the emission intensity of India's GDP to 45% by 2030 from 2005 level. Emission intensity basically means how much carbon is being emitted. So, we will reduce, let us say our previous emission was 100 unit. So, we will reduce those 100 units, and instead of 100 we will reduce them by 45%. So, now in a very simple sense we will emit remaining 55 only. That is what carbon intensity, emission intensity is. So, we will cut down our carbon emission by shifting towards the green sources or by shifting towards the new technology. Okay. So, that is something which we have a target. Now, next is mineral security partnership. So, recently in order to ensure mineral security, India have joined this partnership. Understand one more thing, to ensure mineral security we have set up a cabal. What is Kabil? It is Khaniz Bidesh India Limited. So, the objective is that this institution, that is actually a joint venture between 3 companies. So, this will tie up with different countries to ensure minerals for India, that is to ensure mineral security for India. Now, for example, it has recently tied up with various countries for lithium. Lithium is important component for the battery of electric vehicles. 3 countries are known as lithium triangle, that is Argentina, Bolivia and Chile. Okay, and last component is sovereign green bond. See, green bond basically means companies are issuing bond for the environment friendly project. That means they are saying purchase this bond, give us money, we will use this money to set up this environment friendly project, and in return what you will get? You will get the interest. If the same thing is being done by government or government backed authority, it will be referred as sovereign green bond. Okay, so these are the recent important changes in this particular chapter. Next is related to social sector. So again, the government spending on social services has increased, and it is increasing since 2016. So there is a upward trend, that's first thing. Second thing, the poverty has reduced. In fact, as per Niti Aayog, 24.82 CR people has escaped multi-dimensional poverty between 2013 to 2022-23, and the largest decline was witnessed in the UP and Bihar. Two important things: Niti Aayog released National Multi-Dimensional Poverty Index. On the other hand, UNDP and Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative released Global Index. Global Index has 10 indicators and 3 dimensions. National Index has 12 indicators and same 3 dimensions. What are the additional 2 indicators? One is maternal health, second is bank account. So as per second multidimensional poverty index, the average in India is 14.96%. Let me write it down, 14.96%. This is the level of poverty. The urban poverty has gone down from 8% to 5%. The rural poverty has gone down to 19% from the previous level of 32%. So these are important numbers. The government expenditure on health has increased from 28.6% to 41.4% as a percentage of total health expenditure. In a very simple sense, let us say total expenditure on health is 100 rupee, out of which some amount will be spent by government, some amount will be spent by private players. So the government health expenditure is increasing, and understand, as per National Health Policy NHP, the target is to take it to 2.5% of GDP. This is as a part of total health expenditure. Okay. As of now, our total health expenditure is roughly 2% of GDP, roughly. The education and healthcare spending has witnessed a compound annual growth rate of 9.4%. This is for education and this is for health. Why there is higher growth rate in case of health? Just remember this thing, that because of COVID, the health infrastructure was exposed, that means vulnerabilities were exposed, and therefore government increased the allocation for health infrastructure. That is why higher growth rate. Okay. Now expenditure on R&D, that is research and development, yes, it has increased, but understand it is still way behind than other countries. Another problem is most of our expenditure on R&D is through government. The contribution of private sector is very limited, and that is where the problem lies. For example, the private sector contribute only 36.4%. So in a very simple sense, roughly 1/3 is contributed by private sector and roughly 2/3 is contributed by the government. Apart from that, government is also focusing on sustainable development. So understand one important thing, there are sustainable development goals. These are 17 goals and 169 targets. In case of India, Niti Aayog is the apex organization for SDG. The timeline is that we have to achieve them by 2030, but these are not legally binding. So, they are non-legally binding. Now, understand one thing, Niti Aayog release SDG India Index. SDG India Index. And as per that index, Kerala and Uttarakhand are the top performing states. So, two states, Kerala and Uttarakhand, they are top performing states, their score is 79. Bihar and then Jharkhand are the worst performing states. So, now let us have a look that how over a period of time our sustainable development has changed. Okay. So, if you see, this was the map of 2018 and our score was 57, national average was 57. One more thing, you will get the PDF, so do not worry if you are not able to see it clearly. This was in 2018. Now, in SDG there are 4 categories. The lowest category is aspirant, that means if score is less than 50, that is aspirant category. Then there is a performer category from 50 to 65, then front runner category 65 to 99, and then there is a achiever category, that is 100. Achiever basically means they have achieved these SDG. So, our top performers are 2 states, that is Kerala and Uttarakhand. So, their score is 79. So, very simple question can be asked, how many states are there in achiever category? None. Reason being, achiever means score of 100. We do not have. Okay. Now, coming to this thing. The total score in 2023-24 is 71. So, in 2018 it was 57. But if you see one interesting part, the interesting part is Bihar and Jharkhand. So, in case of Bihar, the score is 57. The national average was 57 in 2018, but the score of Bihar now in 2023-24 is 57. Okay, one more thing, the national average now is 71. That's first thing. Kerala and Uttarakhand were the top performing states with the score of 79. Tamil Nadu followed, that means Tamil Nadu is on second position with a score of 78 and Goa is on third position with a score of 77. Score of Bihar is 57. So, this is something which you should remember, because a very simple question can be asked that how many states are in the aspirant category, how many states are there in aspirant category? Understand and have a look at this map. See, aspirant simply means red, we do not have any red. Just remember this. Why we do not have any red? Because the worst performing state is Bihar, score of Bihar is 57. Aspirant category basically means score of less than 50. Okay. Now, let us move on to the next chapter, that is employment and skill development. So, we have discussed it earlier also that roughly 52% population is not employable even if it is in working age. Reason is it does not have the required skill set. So, over a period of time our workforce participation rate has increased because we have young working age population. The annual unemployment rate is declining since COVID-19 pandemic. The rise in the labor force participation rate is there, that means more and more labor force is there. Unemployment is going down, to important trend. Worker to population ratio basically means how many are employed. So, that has increased. So, three important trends are there. A, our labor force participation rate is increasing, worker to population ratio is increasing, unemployment rate is going down. Okay. Then there is a shift towards gig economy. Understand one important thing, gig economy basically means these workers do not have a traditional 9 to 5 job. They do not have traditional employee-employer relationship. For example, let us say the delivery boys of Swiggy and Zomato. Now, they do not have a full-time job, they are paid on the basis of per delivery, not on the basis of per month. These are referred as gig workers, and this entire economic setup is referred as gig economy. Basically, the workers are hired for a specific task. They are not long-term workers, and that is why they are subject to exploitation also. That is why the Karnataka government was in news because of the social security provisions for these workers. Okay. Now, over a period of time, because of rising digitization, the scope of gig economy is bound to increase. Because of climate change, it may lead to new employment opportunity. Why climate change will lead to new employment opportunity? Because of climate change, we are shifting towards a green transition. Green transition basically means shifting towards the clean initiatives, and therefore it will lead to new employment initiatives. So, as per economic survey, this is going to create roughly 3.4 million green jobs by 2030. Apart from that, the survey also talks about care economy. Care economy simply means the work done for the care. Now, it may be paid, it may be unpaid. Unpaid basically means the work done by our mothers in our house. They don't get salary for this. This is unpaid work. On the other hand, the work done by nurse in the hospital, that is also a part of care, but it is paid work. Okay. Then there is a silver economy. Silver economy basically refers to senior citizens related. So, over a period of time, our population of senior citizens will increase, and that is why there is a huge growth potential in that also. That means the products which are designed for the senior citizens. Next chapter is related to agriculture. So, we have seen this, that in case of agriculture, the growth rate was quite low, and that is why we are facing problem. Another issue is that vast majority is still dependent on agriculture, but the contribution in GDP is quite low. So, roughly 50% population is dependent on agriculture, but in GDP the contribution is roughly 17%, and that is why there is a problem of disguised unemployment. Disguised basically means hidden. Okay. So, in agriculture, our food grain production was record high, and it was all time high. Yes, this number is important, 329.7 million ton. Oilseed production was roughly 41.4 million ton. But there is one major issue. We don't have much storage capacity. In fact, our storage capacity is roughly 47% of our total production. And that is why there is a huge scope of wastage, and that is why there is a consistent food inflation. Okay. In terms of production, India is the largest producer of milk, pulses and spices. In terms of gross capital formation, that is asset creation in agriculture, it has increased by 19.4%. Over a period of time, government has increased subsidies for agriculture. In fact, agricultural subsidies has increased more than twice from 2011 to 2021, and the highest allocation is for fertilizer subsidy and then for power subsidy, that is subsidy for irrigation. Apart from that, to ensure food security, government had announced Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Ann Yojana. Under this, roughly 80 crore population will be covered, and the expenditure is roughly 2 lakh crore. Recently, there was a report also that there is a leakage in this kind of public distribution system, and that is why every year government is losing roughly 69,000 crore. Okay. Next is digital public infrastructure for agriculture, that is DPI. So, this is quite important. Public infrastructure means infrastructure has been developed by government to provide services, for example road, for example government school. If it exists in digital format, that is referred as DPI. For example, Aadhaar card, for example UPI, for example ONDC. What is ONDC? Open Network for Digital Commerce. Similarly, we are setting up the digital infrastructure for agriculture. This is basically referred as AgriStack. AgriStack. And this AgriStack is having 3 main pillars. One is a farmer ID, that is Kisan Pehchan Patra. Second is village maps, and third is crop registry. That means what kind of crops are being cultivated, a database of that crop registry. So, that is the objective of this digital public infrastructure for agriculture, so that farmers can get the benefit of this online technologies. Next chapter is related to industry. So, we have seen this, that out of 3 sectors, which sector witnessed highest growth in the last year? So, it was the secondary sector in case of India, and it was the tertiary sector in case of Bihar. Now, the industrial growth rate was 9.5%, the manufacturing contributed to 14.3% of GVA, that is gross value addition. India is the second largest cement producer after China. If you remember, in terms of total investment in Bihar, in terms of total investment as a part of Bihar industrial investment promotion policy, majority of the investment was for food processing, then for ethanol, and then for cement sector. Why cement is so important? Because government has announced Pradhan Mantri Gati Shakti Yojana or PM Gati Shakti. As a part of that, infrastructure development will be the focus, and for that the requirement of cement is going to be quite high. Okay. Apart from that, India became net exporter of steel, and India has reduced dependency on external coal. Understand? Coal is required for electricity production, and therefore we have to import it. Now, two things are happening. We are switching towards clean energy, that is one thing. Second thing, our coal production has also increased. That is why the dependency on external sources is going down. And India is exporting lot of medicine to the rest of the world. That is why we are also claiming pharmacy of the world. Roughly 20% is contribution from India. Now, apart from that, MSME is significant player. What is MSME? Micro, small and medium enterprises. So, they contribute roughly 30% of our GDP, roughly 45% of our exports. Now, in this context, the government has also announced PLI scheme. What is PLI? Production linked incentive. That means incentives will be given on production or higher production. Now, PLI was in news recently because of two more issues. A, in PLI 14 sectors are covered, 14 sectors are covered. However, not all sectors received the same kind of benefit. So, let us try to have a look at the PLI. First, let us have a look at the PLI. So, basically majority of the jobs which are created under PLI scheme majority of the jobs are created in these sectors, that is mobile phone sector, pharmacy or pharma sector, and food processing sector. Sectors did not receive much impact are say textile, solar and auto component. So, the objective was to create employment opportunity, and it was 16.2 lakh direct jobs. How many sectors were the focus? 14 sectors were the focus. As of now, how many jobs has been created? So, roughly 6 lakh jobs has been created, but roughly 75% of these jobs are created from these 3 sectors. In fact, if you see in terms of mobile, Apple is the biggest beneficiary of this particular scheme. That means we are trying to encourage the domestic production so that we do not have to remain dependent on imports. Okay. Now, coming to this industry sector, just remember this particular thing also. Within secondary sector, there are different components. For example, construction, for example, manufacturing, for example, electricity, gas and other utilities, and for example, mining and quarrying. Now, understand the overall contribution of this sector is roughly 30%, but this contribution have various subcomponents. For example, the biggest component is of manufacturing, that is roughly 17.3%. Then the second biggest component is construction. But the problem with construction is that majority of the employment in construction sector is of informal nature. That means terms and conditions are not fixed and stable, and that's why there is a problem. The third biggest component is electricity, gas and other utilities, and fourth component is mining and quarrying. So just remember this order. Apart from that, if we talk about research and development, so the highest expenditure on research and development was done on pharma sector, then on textiles. Next chapter is services. So we have covered agriculture, we have covered industry, we have covered other basic parameters. Okay, service sector. The problem with service sector is that it is jobless growth. What is jobless growth? It means jobs are not being created even if there is a growth. So if we try to find out which sector is the leading contributor in our GDP, it is service sector. Which sector is the leading contributor in employment? It is the primary sector. Therefore, it is referred as jobless growth. So it contributed roughly 55% of the GDP, and our service export are roughly 4.4% of the global service export. Now within services, travel and tourism, basically tourism play a significant role. So as World Economic Forum's report, Travel and Tourism Development Index, India is on 39th position. In terms of startups, India is third biggest startup ecosystem. In terms of telecom sector, recently government has allowed 100% FDI. Even in insurance sector, government is considering 100% FDI. As of now, in insurance, 74% FDI is allowed. Our telephone density has increased to 85% in 2024. That means roughly 85% have access to telephone in the sense mobile phone also. Internet density has increased to 68.2% in March 2024. Next chapter is related to infrastructure. So for overall infrastructure development, PM Gati Shakti has been announced. Now if we talk about different mode of transportation, basically for road transportation we have a scheme named as Bharatmala. For rail transportation, we have initiatives like DFC, that is Dedicated Freight Corridor. There are two DFC, EDFC, Eastern Dedicated Freight Corridor, that is only and only for freight. That will start from Punjab and it will end in West Bengal. Then there is WDFC, that is Western Dedicated Freight Corridor, that will start from UP and will end in Maharashtra. Then for waterways, we have national waterways. Then for air transportation, we have Udan scheme, that is Ude Desh Ka Aam Nagrik, that is for civil aviation. So infrastructure spending has increased to 9.5 lakh crore in 2024. Major projects are PM Gati Shakti. Previously, the government had announced National Infrastructure Pipeline. Later, it was subsumed under this PM Gati Shakti. It is also known as National Multimodal Connectivity Plan. Multimodal means different mode of transportation. Okay, government had also announced National Logistic Policy. So this policy was announced in 2022. The objective was to cut down our logistic cost. Logistic cost means transportation cost. So it has two major objectives. One, to be in top 25 as per Logistic Performance Index, that is LPI. This is released by World Bank. As per this index, as of now we are on 38th position and the target is to be in top 25. This is one target of this policy. Second target is to cut down our logistic cost to single digit. Single digit basically means less than 10%. So this is our second target. Apart from that, government is focusing on our transportation infrastructure, social infrastructure and energy infrastructure. In terms of investment on infrastructure, the central government and state government contributed roughly 49% and 29%. That means majority of the infrastructure investment is coming from the government and the contribution of private sector is roughly 22%. If we talk about the budget of 2024-25, infrastructure investment by central government was 3.4% of GDP, and that was basically capital expenditure. And the last chapter is climate change and India. So, 2-3 important things. Because of climate change, the extreme weather circumstances are increasing. Now, this survey highlight certain consumption patterns which will intensify the climate change. For example, it highlight overconsumption. That means we are consuming too much. For example, it says that solar panel generate renewable energy. That's a good thing, but they require, the batteries require mineral extraction, and which is not environment friendly process. Similarly, in case of EV also, we claim that EV are relatively better option. Yes, but what about the batteries? The battery require lithium, and lithium extraction is not at all environment friendly. So that is one problem. Second problem is that there is focus on the energy intensive technology. For example, when we talk about cryptocurrencies are generated through computers, and this process is known as mining, and this is very energy intensive process. Again a problem. Another example, ChatGPT. So whenever you search through ChatGPT, basically the energy requirement is much higher than a basic Google search. Why? Because lot of computing work is to be done, and that require lot of energy. That means power I am talking about. Apart from that, there is a focus on per capita emitters. Now understand, this is most important part. We usually say that India is a significant emitter, but if we try to compare the percentage, the difference is very high. For example, in terms of overall CO2, global CO2 emission, India contribute 8%. Our contribution is 8%. The contribution of China is 32%. The contribution of USA is 13%, and the contribution of European Union is 7%. So in terms of overall emission, China, US, India, EU, that is the order. That is 32%, 17%, 8% and 7%. But India's argument is you will have to see the per capita emission also. It does not make sense to compare our population to the European Union. Our population is too much, so our overall emission is going to be higher, but our per capita emission is very low in comparison to European Union. So that is our main argument. Apart from that, the government has also announced Mission Life. Life basically stands for Lifestyle for Environment. This was announced by our Prime Minister during COP26. This COP26 held in Glasgow in UK. Basically, the objective is that we have to focus on a sustainable lifestyle which does not have adverse impact on the environment. So that was Union Economic Survey. Just try to remember the most important trends and you are good to go. See, there is no point in losing your sleep for each and every factual information. You won't be able to remember it. And one more thing, right now you should revise and revise. That is it. All the best for your exam. Thank you.